to school, ring the bell, brand new shoes, walking blues, climb the fence, books and pens. I can tell that we are gonna be friends.
Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, Berlin citizens, citizens of Germany, it is an honor and a pleasure for me to welcome you today to the second day of the Berlin Freedom of Expression Forum. I must say it's an honor for the Institute for Cultural Diplomacy to be hosting this event, especially this afternoon session in front of the Brandenburg Gate here in Berlin. At a time when it's probably the most challenging for us to discuss freedom of expression and human rights, especially when it comes to Syria, there's one man who's amongst us today who has been actually dedicating his entire life to fighting for freedom of expression and fighting for human rights. Someone who has been living in exile in London most of his life and has unceasingly been continuing the struggle to fight for more freedom of expression, more human rights, dignity, as well as the respect for interfaith dialogue and actually all citizens of the world, including also Syrian citizens. He's someone I look up to in many ways, someone who has risked his life on numerous occasions to actually propel the cause forward. Someone, no matter how much criticism he gets, no matter how many threats, etc., continues, in particular for working for interfaith dialogue. And I think really in today's society, that is something that really should be commended and something that should be supported in any way possible. So in that essence, it's really an honor for me to have this gentleman with us, to consider him also a friend and a partner of the Institute for Cultural Diplomacy. And really also, as I said, we were trying to do everything we can to support him in his continuing struggle for human rights in Syria and beyond. The gentleman, of course, I'm talking about, I think needs no further introduction. The founder of the interreligious organization Iman, Mr. Ribal Al-Assad. I'd ask you to please join me in a very, very warm welcome, Mr. Ribal Al-Assad. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Mark, for this introduction. And it's always a great honor to be at the ICD and to be here with you. As you know, it's also a great honor to be in this special place which has inspired me and millions of other people around the world for democracy in our aim to promote democracy and freedom and human rights in the Middle East and around the world. First, I would like to start with a brief tale of two regional revolutions. One was quick, relatively painless, and defined an era in international relations. The other is slow, bloody, and its outcome is far from dear. The first took place here in Berlin and across Eastern Europe in 1989. It happened live on our television screens. And what is easy to forget in this internet age is that the fall of the Soviet Union took place without the use of a single mobile phone, a Facebook message, or a tweet. The second revolution is currently taking place in Syria and across parts of the Arab world, where a tsunami of postings, messages, and videos from the front lines of the Arab Spring have inundated us with news and information, but have not facilitated a happy ending. Sadly, despite its many obvious merits, new media does not provide the elixir of democracy. I will explore the reasons for this shortly. But it is important to start with a little context, and I should start with my surname, which is a mixed blessing. On one hand, it has much associated baggage, but it has also offered me an unparalleled insight and opportunity into events in Syria and the Middle East. I currently live in exile in London, leaving me free to criticize the regime without fear and to champion democratic reform. It also means I'm able to witness at first hand the chasm between Western assumptions about the Middle East and reality. Nowhere is this greater than in the case of new media, where here in Berlin and across Europe, one correctly assumes that the vast majority of people have access to the internet and social media websites. Not so much in the Arab world. In Syria, for example, internet penetration is just 16.5% and largely confined to the elite. And so, however powerful Twitter may be, it's not accessible to the majority. Which is not to say that new media has not played its part in the Arab Spring. Uprising in Egypt, Tunisia, and Libya benefited from extensive use of mobile phones applications. that help to organize people. And they have created a new and powerful way to disseminate news across the region. Cameras are now situated in every part of a war zone, and footage from Tripoli to Homs has often appeared on YouTube before any news channel. It has also proved an effective and efficient way for journalists to release reports. And on that note, I know that you will all want to join me in paying tribute to Mary Colvin and Remy Oshlik, who both have sacrificed their lives in Homs in the name of freedom. Sadly, the various manifestations of the Arab Spring have been stifled by a lack of freedom. As polls in Yemen, Iran, and Zimbabwe have demonstrated, freedom is not just about holding elections. Sunday witnessed the so-called referendum in Syria. On one hand, this provided a nod in the direction of democracy, but in practice, the poll took place under growing international pressure within the echo of heavy shelling and a rising death toll. The infamous clause regarding the Ba'ath Party as the head of the state and society has been replaced with one saying it is a leading party, with other parties requiring a license from the state. And the leader of that state is required in the new constitution to be Muslim in a country where over 15% of the population is Christian. In summary, this appears to be little more than another token gesture from a regime whose behavior has paid little attention to a constitution that forbids torture and guarantees freedom of press and the right to demonstrate peacefully. This is not freedom. Freedom is about pluralism and an independent and free press. The media in Syria is almost entirely state-controlled. There is direct censorship. The regime blocks opposition websites, locks up investigative journalists, and surveys web surfing. In that environment, it's impossible to know what to believe or who to trust. And the problem doesn't stop inside Syria's borders. The Arab media is largely owned or backed by Saudi and Qatar, with Al Jazeera run by the Qatari government and Al Arabiya along with Al Sharq Al-Awsat Al Hayat newspaper owned by Saudis. As I will explain shortly, this creates a one-dimensional view of a multi-dimensional problem. This brings me back to new media, which despite its many benefits, it's often re-reporting news from state-controlled sources and is subject to manipulation from parties who are far from objective. But its major issue is one of its innate simplicity, because the current disaster in Syria is affected by layers of social, religious, sectarian, ethnic, and political complexity. And if new media was the answer, I would be able to give this speech in 140 characters and then retweeted it. At present, the traditional and new media pick on events in Syria in isolation. The referendum, the conference in Tunis, the UN veto, the Arab League intervention, the butchery on the street of Homs, the lethal exchanges of insults and accusations between the regime and elements of its opposition, the international pleas for a peaceful outcome. In practice, even sections of the traditional media have struggled to unpick the many long and tangled fuses that lead to the explosive events we see on our TV screens and YouTube accounts. And I am grateful for this opportunity to attempt to provide a clearer picture of the tectonic diplomatic plates colliding in Syria. Because there are three levels to the current crisis: the internal, the regional, and the global, each of which are impossible to view in isolation. On a global scale, we are witnessing the early stages of a new Cold War, with China and Russia on one side, and the United States and NATO on the other. It's evidence in what China perceives to be a US policy of encirclement, combined with Russia's concerns with the US missile shields and in Chinese currency protectionism. These issues continue to bubble, and as with the Cold War of the last century, the superpowers hone in on the world's trouble spots to fight the proxy battles. For many years, the focus of the Middle Eastern conflict has been Israel, but that is currently taking a backseat to the sectarian divide between Shias and Sunnis across the Arab world. This is not a new conflict, and it has caused much historic bloodshed including the Iran-Iraq war in the 1980s. But the battleground has shifted. On one side, the imperialist Iranian regime that put down its own Green Revolution with impunity and is now posturing for a fight abroad. To do so, it requires allies, and it has been directly involved in issues from the Strait of Hormuz, Afghanistan via Iraq, Lebanon, Bahrain, and the 3 UAE islands to Syria. Where the survival of the current regime is in Tehran's strategic interest, particularly at a time when nuclear programs are so prominent. Meanwhile, Turkey's economic clout grows in the West, bringing with it an ever-growing influence in the Middle East, motivated by its political, cultural, and religious opposition to Iran. And so it courts Saudi Arabia and Qatar, two influential power brokers in the Arab League who are both breeding Islamic fundamentalism. In line with its aim of widening the sectarian divide, Saudi has described as excellent the idea of arming Syria's rebels. Qatar also has a recent history of empowering extreme Islamism in Libya and Egypt. And the media-friendly term Arab Spring can only be understood in this context, because the ever-growing tide of fundamentalism has created a sinister context to the protest movements across the region. In Egypt, Tunisia, and Libya, the peaceful majority who sparked the initial uprising are now experiencing a lesson that should have been learned from the aftermath of the war in Iraq. That is relatively easy to demand and incite regime change, but the real challenge lies in managing to fill the void peacefully and democratically. Which brings me back to Syria, my home, and currently the focus of all this international and global tension. The Chinese and the Russians. UN veto and apparent support for the regime is well publicized across the Western media, as is the West's condemnation of President Assad and support for the SNC opposition. But what is being overlooked at this crucial moment in time is the makeup and motivation of that opposition. This brings me to the hub of the problem, because as Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, President Sarkozy, and William Hague have all agreed in recent weeks, a vicious regime can only be toppled by a unified opposition. But in Syria, over 45% of the population represented by minorities is ignored by the SNC. The SNC was not elected, and as Democrats we must ask a series of crucial questions. Why was it chosen? How did it come to the ascendancy? From where did it get its legitimacy? How democratic was that process? Sadly, the answer suggests that the opposition is no more democratic or moderate than the regime. As we have pointed out so many times in the past, the SNC's membership is 80% Islamist. Even a member of the party itself told Reuters a few days ago that it was overwhelmingly Islamist. It has been imposed upon us Syrians with no choice or forum or discussion, which means the exclusion of groups as well supported as the Syrian National Democratic Council, the National Coordination Committee, the Kurdish National Councils, and others. My own organization for democracy and freedom in Syria is part of the SNDC, a group with a huge role to play in the establishment of a peaceful long-term future of our country. But despite many written requests to participate in the Friends of Syria conference that met in Tunisia on Friday, it remained uninvited, and its delegation was not allowed to attend despite traveling to Tunis. Haytham Al-Maleh, a lawyer and a human rights activist, a known supporter of Islamists, was last weekend, he's also the executive director of the SNC. He proudly told the press in Tunis that the SNC were the only opposition invited, which comes as no surprise when its appearance at previous attempts to coordinate opposition in my country have been marked by the throwing of apples, tomatoes, and punches. Nor was it surprise only yesterday when it split, and not for the first time. On this occasion, approximately 20 members have broken away to form the Syrian Patriotic Group, and among their number is a certain Haytham Al-Maleh. This opposition is not stable. It is not representative, it is undemocratic, and it is violent. It does not have the confidence or support of the Syrian people. It is not supported by any other opposition party. And as a result, people inside the regime, including army officers, have explained to us that they cannot defect until there is a unified, legitimate opposition recognized as a legitimate, which is an alternative to the Islamist SNC. And so the increasingly desperate and violent regimes comes into conflict with an extremist and unrepresentative opposition backed not just by Turkey but also Qatar and Saudi, who aim to split the Arab world down sectarian lines, inciting violence on state-sponsored television channels such as Safa and Wisal, with clerics openly calling for jihad against the Shias and Alawites. No wonder the initial demonstrations against the Assad regime, instigated by moderate protesters seeking democratic reform and chanting peaceful, 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 and 111, the Syrian people are one, have been hijacked by Islamist extremists who are only too happy to take to the streets in those conditions. All of which simply complicates the core issue, which should be simply to work towards a moderate and pluralistic future in our country and move away from the barbarism that has haunted us for so long. In my view, it's only by giving this full story through channels providing the sophisticated means to do so and making people aware of quite how Syria has fallen into its current nightmare that can help us plan a brighter future. In our case, and in so many countries across the Arab world, the spring is a misnomer, as it appears unlikely to be followed by summer than by bitter and conflicted aftermath. Which is why I continue to campaign for a democratic future, a future where the traditional media is free to investigate, report and analyze, bolstered by new media that is available to all. But this will not come about through the actions of Ankara, Riyadh or Doha, where the Syrian people are irrelevant bystanders in a demonic game of regional politics and sectarian interests. Nor will it come from Tehran, whose support for the regime will not relent. It requires the United States and the West to articulate a clear policy on Syria. And this is where the moderate Syrian opposition and minority groups across the country are being let down on a massive scale. I mentioned earlier how Secretary Clinton stressed the need for a unified opposition in the quest for inclusive, transitional, peaceful and democratic change. This was what we have needed to hear for so long. But in Tunis on the weekend, she changed her tune. And I quote, "We view the Syrian National Council as a leading legitimate representative of Syrians seeking peaceful, democratic change and as an effective representative for the Syrian people with governments and international organization." She then urged all Syrians to come under its umbrella. This dealt a terrible blow to the chances of avoiding a full-blown Syrian civil war. And it came as even more of a shock when it came just 24 hours after US Director of National Intelligence James Clapper described the opposition as fractured and not a national movement, before suggesting that the Syrian opposition has been infiltrated by Al-Qaeda elements and that the recent bombings in Aleppo and Damascus against security and intelligence buildings had all the earmarks of an Al-Qaeda-like attack. Sadly, Clapper's warnings were ignored, and it appears that the West is now formally supporting an Islamist opposition, backed by non-democratic countries, including Saudi Arabia and Qatar, knowing that they will be backing Islamists as they have already done in Egypt and Libya. And it is not like there is a lack of case history in this area. After all, the West ill-advisedly supported the Iraqi National Congress a decade ago, misunderstanding its true character and motivation, and paid the consequences. But until this parallel situation is rectified in Syria, our minorities are left with an awful choice between the incumbent terror and the prospect of a fundamentalist alternative that has demonstrated in opposition that it is fundamentally undemocratic. This is a recipe for disaster. The term civil war is bandied around by international observers, but the truth is that this is building towards something even worse, a regional war. Attracting vested sectarian and political interests from across the Arab world and beyond. The prospect is petrifying. In the meantime, I will continue to plead with the free media across the democratic world to raise awareness of this issue, to campaign for the West, to plan for what happens after the regime falls, and to ensure that a country that is home to such a rich mosaic of people and with such a moderate past can look forward to the sort of independent, liberal future that every Berliner now quite rightly takes for granted. And at the heart of this democracy, there should be a strong and free media, critical of its leader, cynical about its politicians, and passionate about its right to freedom of expression. Thank you very much.